Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics. In this video, I'd like to add my own comments to an excellent report which highlights the gross miscalculations that the government have injected into our pandemic response and how continuing with the same mindset will prevent us from ever getting on top of this healthcare crisis. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, the best way to expose the incompetence of a government is to condense what they say about a key subject over a period of time into a single short report. Work to treat with President Trump, and when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic, Byline Times has done this superbly with the UK government. I'll put a link in the description below for those who wish to read it themselves. But what I'd like to pick up on are a few of the features that explain why it is that our scientific modelling, or the scientific modelling that was pushed by the government, came up with the wrong results. So when the easing of the lockdown goes tits up, the government will blame everyone but themselves. They'll blame the scientists and then they will blame the public. Now, when they have to blame the public later this month, I'm going to be interested in seeing how that goes. Will they be successful in their intended divide and rule tactics, or will the unity over the condemnation of Dominic Cummings, and in particular the government's response to that, make the people of this country throw that blame right back into Johnson's grinning mug? In fact, I wish to talk about that in another video today. Actually, it may have already come out. I don't know. Scheduling. But anyway, as to the scientists, that blame has already begun. They started that last month. When the government were initially talking about their plans for the pandemic, before the lockdown, in early March, they were citing a trajectory that would have been wholly different to countries such as Italy, for example, at the time was really getting beaten over by this. In the end, our peak was higher than Italy's, and it lasted longer. With Italy, the peak went up and then it came down fairly quickly because they took action. Too late to stop the peak getting as high as it did, but they took action when it became clear it was out of control. We didn't take appropriate action, and so that peak stayed there for a long time. In other words, a right arse was made of our response, and our predictions were hopelessly wrong. The government are seeking to blame this on Duff's scientific advice. But the only thing the scientists got wrong was agreeing to work under conditions that would inevitably lead to this outcome. They should have refused. Now, I do understand the pressures on them, by the way. I know it's easy for me to say they should have refused, but they really should have. Because an essential part of the scientific method is peer review. Your results need to be replicated by others, and the conclusions validated by those who may have access to different data. More pieces in the jigsaw, so to speak. But the government imposed on our scientific advisors a very unscientific way of working. They weren't allowed to coordinate with one another. Peer review became impossible because of the need to keep all deliberations secret. The government never followed the science, they just used SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, to justify their own political decisions. They even put political appointments into the SAGE group, which is supposed to be comprised of scientists. But scientists in a SAGE group would normally share their findings and deliberations publicly. There'd be public debate. This couldn't happen, or it would be impossible for the government to claim that they'd followed the science, because it'd be obvious that they hadn't. Either that, or they would have actually had to follow the science, in which case our population would currently be tens of thousands higher than it currently is. The government's insistence on complete secrecy meant that the essential peer review of scientific research and study and the mathematical modelling that went alongside it simply couldn't take place. And little wonder then that the predictions were being invalidated by reality every few days as the crisis grew during March. And then you have to consider this. Has anything fundamentally changed? No. Greater numbers of SAGE scientists have gone public with their objections to the government's behaviour, making it clear that in no way, shape or form is what the government doing based on their scientific advice. It's very similar to the decision by the government not to commission any economic impact reports into Brexit. They're keeping themselves deliberately ignorant, not because they want to keep themselves deliberately ignorant, but more specifically, they don't want this information getting out to the public, because then we'll see what an absolute mess they're trying to make of it. They want to reduce the amount of paperwork that would need to be entitled, "This government is dangerously insane." Then there's the selection of the modelling. A mathematical model is only as good as the data you provide for it and the parameters that you set. The data was poor because our level of testing was pitiful. That level of testing has improved, but it is still extremely low. The government initially fiddled their testing figures by counting tests that never took place and counting one test as two because the stick has two ends. Not even kidding, that's a thing. More recently, they've stopped even announcing the number of people tested to avoid highlighting the fact that there has been no improvement for over a month now. So the data for models, even now, is not what it should be because we're not testing enough to provide that data. But then there are the parameters. Now, you can set these to be whatever like. Indeed, when you create a mathematical model, you don't create one model anyway. You create lots of ones with different parameters and run multiple simulations to give you the best possible picture for various credible scenarios. But that's not what the government did. They simply picked the model whose results best matched their desired outcome, not the one that was most likely. This is another reason why their confidence in predicting the trajectory kept going so badly wrong. The purpose of running different models is supposed to be based on an awareness of gaps in your knowledge. You are then supposed to seek out the answers to the unknown questions in order to throw some models out, refine the ones that are still standing up to your data. But, like I said, instead of ramping up to adequate levels, the government focused on pulling the wool over our eyes. So instead of seeking more data, they just fiddled the data that they had. And this seems reasonable to politicians. After all, politics is about winning arguments. Doesn't matter whether you win it by fair means or foul. Sometimes, yes, people do use politics to solve problems as well. There are good politicians. But it is by no means the purpose of politics for many. And there have been a number of quite heinous errors on the part of our government during this crisis. But many of their missteps, I think, essentially boils down to this willful blindness. Without it, the other missteps couldn't really have happened. You cannot solve any problem without data, and a pandemic absolutely needs data. And yet we ended up with a situation where the government calculated that it was more expedient for them to deliberately deprive us of the data needed. I honestly think they understand this now, and they don't care still. They're just riding this storm out until they're pinning all their hopes on a cure or a vaccine. That's it. If it doesn't come, I don't know what they're going to do. I absolutely think at the moment their plan is to still keep hiding things, not seeking data because the data makes them look bad, and the more time goes on, the worse it makes them look, and just hoping for a vaccine that will end it, and that'll be that. Because that's what they've done. They have decided that acquiring data makes them look bad, and that was the clinching argument. Not concerns about how a world-beating death toll would look. That's a problem for the future. They'll worry about it then. And that same consideration still holds sway. If anything, the further down the road they go, the more damaging the data is going to be. But without genuinely ramping up our level of testing and properly disseminating the data from it, the further down that dead end the path we travel. It's a vicious circle that will never be beaten. Quite simply, it would seem that when we get to the point where we can say that we are past this pandemic, it will have nothing to do with our government's actions. It will be in spite of it, not because of it. President Trump said that the virus would just disappear like a miracle. Well, in the UK, we're pretty much pinning all our hopes on that being true. And, because if you haven't been paying close attention, this is the latest from the government during their COVID briefing last night, just to finish off. So, Boris Johnson announced 2 or 3 weeks ago this magical level 1 to 5 system. 5 is absolutely terrible. 1 is, we're basically on top of this. And he said we're at level 4. Didn't say how we're at level 4, but he said we're at level 4. So yesterday they were saying we've moved from level 4 to level 3. Now we know this isn't true. They're just saying that to justify their easing of the lockdown. Except, of course, the easing of the lockdown now taking place was supposed to occur at level 1, not level 3. The extent of it, at any rate. Still, we are apparently now not at level 4, but at the magically arrived at level 3. Now, here's the thing. How do we know we're at level 3? Good question. The body which is supposed to be scientifically determining our level is the Joint Biosecurity Centre. So, the Joint Biosecurity Centre has announced we're at level 3, have they? No, not exactly. According to Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, last night, the Joint Biosecurity Centre doesn't actually exist. It will apparently, but at the moment it doesn't actually exist. So we're apparently at level 3 according to an organisation that doesn't exist. But it doesn't exist. So who is actually determining our current level then? I reckon Dominic Cummings blindfolded throwing darts behind his head at a modified dartboard. But anyway, with that little boost of confidence, I'll leave it there. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.